on Being You.
The global COVID-19 pandemic has cast a new light on our sixth principle, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. In that new light, institutions that have formed the basis of our economies and social orders have been brought under closer scrutiny. How did this happen? First, the spread of the virus demonstrated the vulnerability of the world community. The pandemic that first appeared in China in November of 2019 arrived in Europe, the United Kingdom, India, Australia, and the United States by January of 2020. By February of 2020, South America, Iran, Egypt, and Nigeria joined the growing list of countries in the world community reporting confirmed cases of COVID-19. As the year 2020 progressed, nation after nation was added to the list of those affected by the pandemic until in December of 2020, Antarctica became the last continent to report confirmed cases of COVID-19. The virus now had the full attention of the global community. Next, the pandemic affected economic systems and caused sudden and severe social disruption around the world, which, in turn, raised issues of racial and geographic discrimination, health equity, and the balance between public health imperatives and individual rights. In the light of the pandemic, what can we see of our progress toward reaching the goal of peace, liberty, and justice for all? If recognizing the interdependence of all life, we strive to build community, the strength we gather will be our salvation. If you are black and I am white,
It will not matter.
if you are female and I am male,
It will not matter.
if you are older and I am younger,
It will not matter.
if you are progressive and I am conservative,
It will not matter.
if you are straight and I am gay,
It will not matter.
if you are Christian and I am Jewish,
It will not matter.
if we join spirits as brothers and sisters, the pain of our aloneness will be lessened, and that does matter.
In this spirit, we build community and move toward restoration. Marjorie Bowens Wheatley.
Since what we choose is what we are, and what we love we yet shall be, the goal may ever shine afar, the will to win it makes us free. The ceaseless flow of endless time, no one can check or stay. We'll view the past with no regret, nor future with dismay. The present slips into the past, and dreamlike melts away. The breaking of tomorrow's dawn begins anew today. The past and future ever meet in the eternal now, to make each day a thing complete shall be our New Year vow.
I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do the something that I can do. Edward Everett Hale.
Our speaker today is Betsy Baer, and her topic is Reflections on COVID, How We Really Are All in This Together. Betsy Baer is a former health and leave COVID administrator for an international corporation. She managed COVID cases from the start of the U.S. shutdown in early 2020 through December the 31st of 2021. She currently advises the Terre Haute UU board on COVID matters. She's a business owner and has a master's degree. Okay, so Betsy, how did the pandemic start for you, and what was it like to become a COVID administrator?
So the pandemic started for me just a few weeks after I had actually been hired by the company that I worked for. Within a couple weeks of starting the company and finishing my training, actually, I had just finished training to work for this company, COVID started. It was a time of a lot of uncertainty. The company that I worked for, we do work with the public. We do work with federal contracts, state contracts. We work with colleges. We're the kind of company that we can't just shut down and go to working from home. So it was a very tense situation as soon as the government started talking about shutting down, because we knew that a lot of our workers did not work in the office and did not work at corporate and did not work even in our satellite offices. And so there was a lot of conversation about what in the business can we shut down. Becoming a COVID administrator was not something obviously I had expected to happen, or anyone I think had expected to happen. The position of COVID admin, it exists in a lot of different companies, but it did not exist until the pandemic happened. It was definitely unprecedented.
Well, then how long did it take for your company to actually respond to the COVID crisis, and what was that response?
Unfortunately, I think it took our company a little too long to respond to the COVID crisis. We were one of the first companies in Indianapolis that actually had an outbreak, because though our corporate office was just administrators and the board and our, VPs and everything like that, we still had people that needed support out in the field. And so, and like many other companies, we were not built to go virtual at all. We did not have, not that we didn't have the capacity, but we didn't have all of the equipment needed. And our bandwidth was not strong enough. We had a VPN that our company ran on that you would have to log into in order to get your phone calls and all of this stuff. And we had never had to pay for the level of tech needed to work from home. So we honestly delayed our shutdown in the company as long as we possibly could. I didn't think it was wise at the time. I definitely remember having conversations with some of the upper management as an administrator who was dealing with people on the ground who were very nervous about getting COVID, because keep in mind, this is the beginning of the pandemic and we didn't know what COVID would do to you. And there was a lot of information coming out. And I kept saying to the upper management, we need to go home. We need to go home. However this needs to happen, however we need to beef up our tech, we are an international company, but we need to go home. And ironically, I was the last person to leave the office. And I was one of the first people exposed to COVID because we waited so long, and we ended up with one of our IT people testing positive and having a very bad case of COVID because we waited so long to shut down.
Well, so there was a lot of information coming out of state, federal, and global levels about COVID. So how did you discern what was factual and pertinent?
So, yes, there was a lot of information coming out at the time. The WHO, the World Health Organization, was on it. Unfortunately, our CDC took a little bit of time to respond, and a lot of the states had their own task forces. But in terms of discerning what was actually pertinent, we stuck with a lot of the stuff of the WHO, of the World Health Organization. We also started tracking with the Johns Hopkins University almost at the very beginning of the pandemic, practically within the first week or so of really saying, no, this is a pandemic. The Johns Hopkins University started releasing a lot of the research that was coming out. They started doing a lot of public releases and a lot of tracking. That a lot of the tracking that we did with the Johns Hopkins University, which is a very well-respected university. They're very good about, not only turning out their own scientific research, but scanning the scientific research out there and pulling out the pertinent information. Johns Hopkins University and WHO both were very, very good about taking the scientific jargon and making it as clear as they could in layman's terms and trying to keep it non-political, because this is a pandemic that was obviously starting to kill people.
So what did you do with that information in terms of translating it into company policy or an action plan?
Our company was a safety company, and one of the things that you have to do when you are a company that deals with the public and you are a safety company providing a safety service is you have to have a prevention plan. A lot of our contractors that we work with require a prevention plan anyway. So we already had prevention plans in place for if equipment blew out or if a person was injured. We did have workers' comp. So we took that prevention plan and then took a lot of the information from the WHO. And once the CDC jumped on it, and once, Johns Hopkins had all of their tracking out, we took that information and started putting it into the prevention plan. I will say it took our company a while to respond because, again, in all due respect to everyone who was working there were a lot of people who didn't believe this was a pandemic. So it wasn't just about taking the information and turning it into a policy. We were also fighting against people who didn't believe that the pandemic was real. We had an employee at one point that said, "Oh no, all of the deaths that you're hearing about in COVID, well, those are really heart attacks and they're just saying it's COVID." Or at one point I heard the most outrageous thing that was, "Oh, all of the motorcycle accidents are being called COVID." We had a lot of people who were believing misinformation. And they were within our company. So fighting against that preset mind of COVID doesn't exist. And then also saying, well, we are a safety company, so we have to have prevention policies. I just took the information that was consistent, because when the WHO and the Johns Hopkins University and the CDC and the Ministry of Health in Canada and the European Union's health organizations are all agreeing that this really is the study, this is legitimate, this is what's happening, this is what we recommend, and this is what the scientists have found works, we would just basically take the most frequent message that was also the safest message. Right. So if someone was saying, "Oh, you only have to quarantine for 3 days," and 5 other institutes were saying, "No, the quarantine is actually 14 days. We're going to go with the majority of 14 because that's multiple studies." I mean, when you look at like 117 countries that have done multiple studies and most of the studies are saying XYZ, that XYZ is what's going to go into the prevention plan, not the conspiracy theory. It's going to be the actual scientific study, and it's going to be screened by not only Johns Hopkins, but it goes through Oxford University, it goes through the Mayo Clinic, places that are known for their good scientific research.
So this pretty much is getting into the next question, which was, how did the employees of your company respond to the information and policy changes?
Yeah, so, I mean, we had people are people. And we had people that immediately jumped on the preventative measures. Our company early in 2021 came out with an incentive program for getting vaccinated. We never required it. I do want to say that. We never required that anyone ever got vaccinated. But we did provide an insurance that covered testing very early. We provided an incentive where we would pay people if they wanted to go and get vaccinated. We would cover 4 hours of their pay. And then that ended up actually getting boosted up to you would get a cash incentive if you got vaccinated. So there were some people that jumped right on that. But we also had people that believed that COVID was a hoax. We had people that had no thought in their brain that this was any kind of good for them to get vaccinated. I actually had an employee at one point tell me, you could offer me a brand new house. I'm never going to get vaccinated.
Whoa, okay. Well, I see you brought along some slides here. Were any of these things that you presented at your seminars?
Yes, so actually the very first slide has a poster from the CDC. In mid-2020, the CDC and OSHA started coming out with posters that employees were asked to adhere to from employers posting them in their companies. You've probably seen them at a restaurant. I'm sure many of the listeners have probably seen them in their own companies, at the front door or at the side door or in the kitchen, basically saying, stop. If you feel ill, do not enter the building.
Now, I know you actually went down and did some seminars at some of their other locations.
One of the things that we had to address at the seminars that I would go to, because the seminars that I was sent to by my company were not just talking point seminars. They were also vaccination clinics. Because this is back when the vaccine was actually holding up to most of the variants. So at the end of 2020, the mid to end 2020, these posters came out, and then the vaccine came out, and then we started doing seminars and clinics. And we would talk about how people would mistake COVID symptoms for allergies. They would mistake COVID symptoms for the regular flu or for a cold or for a sniffle. And so we had to not only have seminars where we would have doctors recording themselves talking about the vaccine, talking about what COVID does to you, but I would also have to sit down with the managers and say, look, we need to make sure that people are being as safe as they possibly can. If we have people who do not want to get vaccinated, then they need to be adhering to these guidelines. If they are ill, they need to be staying home. They need to be reporting it, because shortness of breath, fatigue, fever, you can have all of those with allergies. You can have all of those with the regular cold, but unfortunately, they are also some of the starting symptoms of COVID.
Okay, so you obviously had some COVID cases. What were some of your more difficult cases?
I handled all of the cases for our company. We had 2,000 employees, and some of our employees were actually repeat COVID cases, that they would get COVID, and before they would hit their 90 days where they could get vaccinated, because you have to wait at least 90 days after having COVID, like your last day of symptoms, in order to get vaccinated. We would have people that would get so close to their 90 days and then get another variant. So one of the hardest cases I ever had was from one of those clinics, actually. We had had a breakout of a couple cases of COVID down in a southern state, and we knew that the offices down there and the employees down there were not following our prevention plans. We had a masking policy for our company. We had a 6-foot distance policy. We had a contact tracing. We had a report program in place where if you exhibited symptoms, you would report yourself, so that we could take care of you. You know, a lot of states at the time had pay or some kind of sick leave. And we also, if you tested positive for COVID, we had a sick leave for our company. So there was no reason to not report yourself. And we had had an outbreak at a location where people were not masking, they were not doing social distancing, they were not careful when they were out in the field. And so I was sent down there to hold a COVID clinic and vaccination clinic, because again, at the time, vaccines were holding up to the variant. And we just said, look, you don't have to socially distance according to the CDC, and you don't have to wear a mask if you're fully vaccinated. But you need to get vaccinated, right? We need to up these numbers because you've just had a COVID outbreak. So I go down there and I try to get people vaccinated. And one of the guys that I tried to get vaccinated had been exposed to one of the guys who had COVID, but had not tested positive. And because he hadn't tested positive, he made the assumption that, well, I must just be immune. Natural immunity. Natural immunity for COVID does not exist. There is no such thing. That is one of the big things I learned as a COVID admin. There is no such thing as natural immunity. There is luck. That is all you get. So this guy had been exposed to COVID. He didn't get COVID. He tested negative. So when I came down to try and get him vaccinated, because I was like, you were so lucky, get vaccinated before you get exposed again. His response was, oh, I'm healthy, I'm fine, I have a natural immunity. I finished the seminar. I got one person out of, I think it was 15 people vaccinated, and it wasn't this person. Went on to a couple other seminars, flew back home, and about 2 or 3 weeks later, I get a phone call from my boss and his boss. We had a conference call, and his boss was incredibly upset. Because you have to also keep in mind, a lot of our employees that were down there had worked at this location for a long time. They knew each other. They were like family. His boss was distraught, and he said, well, this person's parent has called us and they are in the hospital. And this guy that I had talked to and said, you need to get vaccinated, who was so sure that he had COVID immunity, was admitted to the hospital, was intubated, and then his case just kept getting worse and worse. And at one point, the deprivation of oxygen that he had started causing swelling and tumors in his brain, and they had to remove a third of his skull to save his life. And this is a guy who was in his early 20s, who I had talked to please get vaccinated. You were so lucky. And then he ended up partially paralyzed.
Did he have pre-existing conditions?
No. In fact, when he went into the hospital, at first, his boss and a couple of the people at his office kept trying to say, oh, those tumors must have been pre-existing. That brain swelling must have been pre-existing. COVID must have saved his life. But the longer we went into his case, the more we found, no, he was fine before he got COVID. So that was a really hard case to handle because I had spoken to him in person. And I remember how obstinate and just firm he was that he had COVID immunity and the vaccine would do nothing for him. And he had no idea what was in that vaccine. So how would it benefit him? And though, no, I can't guarantee that the vaccine would have saved him, I've been vaccinated and I've been boosted, and I had a really bad case of COVID afterwards, and I was not hospitalized. But I'm well aware of the fact that I could have been, because even with the vaccine, I felt so sick. And another really hard case we had was a gentleman who was older, but again, no pre-existing conditions, unvaccinated. And I spoke to his boss and him on the phone saying, how are you feeling? How are you doing? Oh, I'm feeling really awful. Well, if you start finding that you can't track a conversation, if you find that you're having trouble breathing, if you find that you are so exhausted you cannot wake up, you need to go to urgent care. And that was like the last time I talked to him, because the next time that I had communication was with his boss saying he's been admitted to the hospital. After that, it was, he is very, very ill and they're going to be putting him on oxygen. Then it was, they're going to intubate him. And then barely five days after that conversation, we got a call from the daughter saying that he had passed away. And it was in the span of like barely 7 days from the first time that I talked to him saying, how are you feeling, to his daughter planning his funeral. Was 7 days. That was it.
To bring this back to Unitarian Universalist principles, we want to talk about the global view of community. How do you think being a COVID administrator has changed you and your global view of community, having dealt with something so unprecedented?
I think that the way that it has changed me personally is that I have realized if you're not willing to be open and have the tough conversations, it is detrimental. in the end to our global community. One of the biggest frustrations I ever had when I was handling these COVID cases, because I handled hundreds of COVID cases, and I handled a lot of hospitalizations, and I handled lifetimers, people who had COVID and ended up with scarring inside their lungs and on disability for the rest of their lives. And I would get so frustrated with the management, but I would also get frustrated with fellow employees who didn't want to have the tough conversation of, you need to get vaccinated. You need to wear your mask. You need to keep socially distancing, because there was COVID fatigue. And there's this attitude, I feel globally, of, oh, well, we just let people live and let live. That's great, but we are also responsible for each other. Society does not exist if we do not care. One of the things that I was told when I got ready to leave my position was, from some of the management who had worked with me and worked really diligently to keep their people from not getting sick. And their locations very rarely had breakout cases because they did take it seriously and diligently, was that they were so sad I was leaving because I was one of the few people that was gentle and kind. I don't want anyone to get harmed, but I will still have that hard conversation with you. I never shied away from the bullet. I never shied away from saying, I want you to wear your mask, and I'm going to be very firm about this. But I'm not saying this to be a jerk. I'm not saying this because I want to control you. I'm saying this because you better be breathing tomorrow. And I think as a global community, we need to care a bit more about the fact that the person we're talking to could stop breathing tomorrow if we do not care for them enough to hold them accountable.
What was your personal experience of being exposed to COVID?
So, over the Christmas holiday, my sister and her family, they'd all been vaccinated except for the 3-year-old. My sister was very diligent about teaching her kids to mask, because you have to remember, you model the behavior that you want to see in your children. So this idea that children can't mask because it's hard for them. No, it's hard for you as an adult, but you have to model it, and you have to be the adult. You have to be the parent. So Crystal, being the parent, had taught all of her children, including the 3-year-old, to mask. They had also quarantined in their house for 2 weeks before they came home. We quarantined in our house, mom, dad, myself. I worked from home. Mom and dad are retired. We had quarantined in our house and not gone around anyone without our masks for about 2 weeks before Crystal and Weldon came home. So knowing that we had all quarantined ahead of time, we had all tested, we had all made sure that we were all negative, Crystal and Weldon had flown home. The problem was, yes, in an airport, in an airplane, you have to mask. It is required. But in the terminals, especially a terminal like LAX in Los Angeles, which is where they were, unfortunately, there are just not enough people to enforce the masking policy in the airport. So in the terminals, there were people who were coming in to see the other travelers off that were not masking. The thing about masking and being vaccinated is that you both have to mask, and preferably you are both vaccinated in order to prevent a breakout. People who are walking around unmasked and probably unvaccinated expose the person who is wearing a mask to COVID, and it can get on your clothes. COVID can actually get to you through your eyes, the tear ducts of your eyes, and it's like pink eye. Pink eye is actually one of the symptoms of COVID. So they flew through LAX. They did not have a stop. It was a direct flight. They got home. We brought them home. And then they went into an Airbnb, and we were here at the house. All of us being vaccinated, we took our masks off because we had all quarantined for 2 weeks. The problem was that Crystal and Weldon were at an airport where masking was not being enforced, social distancing was not being enforced, and Crystal picked up COVID. Also, my sister she had been vaccinated, she had been boosted, but she had only been boosted 7 days before they came home. You are not fully vaccinated, and your booster is not fully boosted until 14 days after the date of injection. So she wasn't really fully boosted. Just like people at work who thought that they were fully vaccinated and got COVID, they weren't fully vaccinated. They had been dosed and they were still 2 weeks out from being fully vaccinated, and they took their mask off and went to a party. So that was part of our problem with our outbreak. Did I get exposed? Absolutely. Did I get Omicron? Absolutely, because that is the variant that jumps. What I wasn't was hospitalized. And Crystal, even though her booster was not 14 days out, so she was not fully boosted, and the vaccine does not hold up against Omicron without a booster at all, so she wasn't boosted. She picked it up, but because she was vaccinated, she also did not end up hospitalized.
So there are a lot of guidelines and recommendations about how to handle COVID, and these guidelines and recommendations are going to change. What do you say to someone who says these new guidelines are confusing or the changes are too fast to track?
Stick to an abundance of caution. That is what I always told the employees who would be like, oh, well, you know, your company policy says we have to quarantine for 14 days, but the Ministry of Health says it can be 7. You can still be shedding the virus up to 8 days after your symptoms start and 3 days before you start exhibiting symptoms. Shedding the virus, think of it like a dog, right? If you've ever had a pet and you've brushed them or they just shake, fur goes everywhere. It gets all over your clothes. It gets all over your carpet, it gets all over your furniture, even if you don't allow them on the furniture. You can still be shedding that virus. So I always say, act out of an abundance of caution. The initial quarantine recommendations were 14 days, and I still stick to that. And yes, I did get exposed to COVID, but keep in mind, the person that gave me COVID was not fully boosted, had quarantined, but then had gone into public and then not quarantined 14 days after that exposure. If we had really acted out of abundance of caution, they would have quarantined and we would have quarantined for 14 days. They would have gotten on the plane, flown here, and then we would have had them quarantine in their own house for another 14 days. So the question becomes, on the CDC, on one of my slides, it mentions that the shortened amount of quarantine time is for, social health and going back to work and for infrastructure. So who does it really benefit when you say, oh, well, I'm going to shorten my quarantine because the CDC says I can, and also I only have so much time? Who does it really benefit? Because do you really have so much time? Or maybe could they have come 14 days early? Or should they have come home for Christmas? That's the other thing, is we talk about how, well, we need to get together and we need to be together as people. Yes, and we are a global community. But if we all quarantined for 14 days, I guarantee you this pandemic would be over. If we actually quarantined and people stopped making excuses for what they want, not what they need. I truly believe, and I've talked to a number of people who have been exposed to COVID or have had COVID, or have had family members who have had COVID or have lost someone to COVID. And even the people who were hard non-believers until they experienced COVID themselves have slowly started to come around to the fact that, honestly, the smartest thing that we could ever do as a country, as a society, I know it would be hard. Yes, our economy is taking a massive hit on inflation right now. Yes, our distribution lines are struggling because we just don't have the movement of freight that we need because people are constantly out sick for COVID. If we were truly a global society, the smartest thing we could ever do is what we should have done at the beginning. And I think a lot of people agree with me on this. We need to shut down for 2 weeks straight up, because even the people who were hardline against it, who have now since experienced COVID in some way, shape, or form, agree that we could sit home for 2 weeks as long as we had food, shelter, and our medical care and our pharmaceutical meds or whatever we needed for those 2 weeks, we could sit down for 2 weeks and knock this thing out. If everyone stayed home, and I'm not talking a tiered closing like we did the first time where, yeah, we're shutting down, but hair salons are still open. Yeah, we're shutting down, but restaurants are still running. No, if we actually genuinely shut down, we could beat this pandemic, and then we could reopen straight out. Because the only thing that the virus thrives on is us. And if we take us out of the equation and we sit at home for 2 weeks, and we are no longer part of the pool, we're no longer part of the petri dish for a hot second, that virus is going to die. So I think that actually gives me hope that a lot of people are now coming around to the idea that, you know what? As a community, we could do it. We could support each other for 2 weeks. That's not hard. We could take care of each other for 2 weeks. Thank you so much for coming to my talk today. I do hope that you are all staying safe and healthy. I know that this pandemic has been really hard mentally and physically on a lot of people. I am aware of the fact that a lot of our essential workers are out there very much straining. So stay safe, hang in there, and try to stay home when you can and get vaccinated. And we will beat this virus. We are not going to be the Black Plague for 300 years. That is not going to happen. We're going to be fine.
I am a single cell in a body of 4 billion cells. The body is humankind. I am a single cell. My needs are individual, but they are not unique.
I am interlocked with other human beings in the consequences of our actions, thoughts, and feelings.
I will work for human unity and human peace, for a moral order in harmony with the order of the universe.
Together we share the quest for a society of the whole equal to our needs.
A society in which we need not live beneath our moral capacity, and in which justice has a life of its own.
We are single cells in a body of 4 billion cells. The body is humankind. Norman Cousins.
May the blessings of love rest upon you. May peace abide with you. May God's presence illuminate your heart now and forevermore.
Go in peace. Know that you are loved and that your life is sacred.